Wagner in San Francisco, in for Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, raising the risk. The WHO elevates its risk outlook for the coronavirus as multiple countries struggle with containment. Plus, hey there, big spenders. Democratic candidates are spending big online to beat Donald Trump. While they can outspend as a whole, can they outproduce? We will break down the numbers from Facebook. And move over YouTube and Instagram. TikTok wants those digital ad dollars, and it's producing some eye-popping numbers, at least for now. We will dig deeper. But first to our top story, the spread of the coronavirus rattled global financial markets, sending U.S. stocks to their worst week since the financial crisis more than a decade ago. For more, let's go to Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta.
That's right. Stocks seeing its worst week since 2008. Now, it started off on Sunday in the Asia session as we saw those coronavirus fears really take over. And this week just snowballing as folks cut their position. And as we see foreign investors repatriate their money, really pulling out of that U.S. haven asset bid that we saw. But a big difference today at the close that we saw was the NASDAQ was actually turning positive, all thanks to that last minute tech bid in literally the last 10 minutes, if you can believe it. A big thing to note here as we see FANG stocks really get hit hard during the broader U.S. stock market sell-off. That being said, FANG stocks have actually been driving the stock market forward as we see that bid for growth stocks as a whole. A big hitter, though, I want to pay attention to is Apple. Apple's CEO coming out really emphasizing that the concern for the coronavirus shouldn't make a huge difference in terms of moving supply chains, but still being concerned about meeting their revenue guidance. But a big highlight that kind of diverges from this massive tech sell that we see is the SOX index. We did see that SOX index drop on those coronavirus concerns as we saw supply chains really get hit in South Korea, in China, but actually seeing it turn positive today as we see investors buy that dip ahead of the weekend. Kurt?
That was Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta. Kriti, thank you very much. Now, a White House official is acknowledging that the coronavirus is likely to cause disruptions in everyday life in the U.S. Let's take a listen.
Are you going to see some schools shut down? Probably. May you see impacts on public transportation? Sure, but we do this. We know how to handle this.
Now, Mulvaney made those comments at the Conservative Political Action Conference outside of Washington, D.C. today. To discuss, we're joined by Bloomberg's David Baker. David, give us a sense of where we are here, particularly in the state of California. You heard that announcement about the schools. What is happening here in California?
Well, we've got quite a lot of people in the state who are being monitored as possibly having the virus, but not showing the signs of it yet necessarily. It's more than 8,000 people across the state, scattered across nearly 50 different jurisdictions, who are being monitored. In terms of confirmed cases, we've only had 33 so far, and almost all of those have been people where we know pretty much how they got the virus. So far, we only have one where we don't know where she got the virus from, but that's still very troubling to everybody because that means that it's circulating somewhere and we're not exactly sure how widespread it might be.
Could you give us the latest on the efforts to get test kits out in the field to people?
That has been a real bone of contention with state officials and local officials as well. We had, as of yesterday, just 200 test kits in the state, according to Governor Gavin Newsom. And he had just been on the phone, along with some of the state's health officials, had just been on the phone with the CDC, which was promising to send more. But I know one of my colleagues here was calling around today and found like Marin County didn't have any and was expecting them maybe next week. San Francisco didn't have any. So the testing ability is extremely limited right now.
You know, earlier this week, David, there was a kind of mystery case in California where someone contracted the virus and there wasn't a real clear answer as to how. Do we have an update on what happened there?
She's still in the hospital in UC Davis Medical Center. So far as we know, they have not given any kind of update today on her condition. And the state has been going around trying to track down every single person she might have come in contact with over the previous week or two. And in fact, the federal government is sending out 10 people to help with that tracking and tracing effort. But so far as the state knows, there's no obvious way that she got it. She didn't travel anywhere in particular. She hasn't come into contact with anyone that we know might have had the virus. The one thing people are wondering a lot about is we've seen this whistleblower complaint come out of Washington, where somebody from the Federal Health and Human Services Agency was complaining that an Air Force base in the county where this woman lived had federal workers going in and out of quarantine areas without proper training and might have actually gone out in public. So you got to kind of wonder about that, but so far there's no real evidence at all as to how this woman got it.
Well, thank you for tracking that, David. I'm sure we'll have you back on. That was Bloomberg's David Baker. Thanks for being here. Obviously, want to stick with our coverage of the coronavirus and its impact on the tech industry. To do that, let's bring in Ben Legg, the CEO of Digital People International and the former Google Europe COO. Also with us, we have Bloomberg Technology Global Executive Editor Tom Giles. Tom, this is obviously a global issue, but it feels like it's particularly important to the tech industry. Why is that?
Well, I mean, you have to look at this on a couple of different levels. First of all, the technology industry is so intertwined with the rest of the world in terms of the supply chain, particularly when you talk about the consumer electronics manufacturers like the Apples of the world, or there's the Apple of the world. Mm-hmm. So intricately intertwined with China, where this originated. We saw them closing stores. We saw them issue their warning. Now things seem to be slowing down in China, which is great news. Now what's happening, though, is you're seeing these flare-ups elsewhere in the world in places like Korea and Japan and Italy, all of which are also part of Apple's supply chain. So just as you see China kind of maybe things brightening a little bit there, there's other parts of the world where, again, the supply chain will be affected.
Yeah, and speaking of other parts of the world, Ben, you are joining us from Europe. As the former COO of Google Europe there, what can these big tech companies be doing right now, or what should they be doing to make sure that their employees and businesses are safe?
Yeah, well, obviously there's some things that have been quite visible the last few days. So quite a lot of conferences have been cancelled. So, for example, Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, which would normally have 130,000 visitors, has been cancelled. The F8 Facebook Developer Conference has been cancelled. So there's a lot of conferences being cancelled. And then there's a lot of contingency planning. So Europe, it probably feels a bit like it does in the US right now. I'm reading news on both sides of the Atlantic, and there's a lot of panic in the markets. I think, to be honest, too indiscriminate. I think there'll be winners and losers here, not just losers. There's a lot of contingency planning. But to date in Europe, the only real place that's been hit is Italy. Everywhere else is really confused, I think, is the top word.
Tom, Ben mentioned those conferences. You've been to many of them. I've been to many of them. What should we make of this? You know, if F8 doesn't happen, if perhaps WWDC doesn't happen, is this a big deal for these companies?
Well, nobody wants to be the company or the organizer that let their conference go ahead and the disease, or the virus, spreads in that context. And when you bring a lot of people together, from all over the world, which is always the case at places like Mobile World Congress, F8, the list goes on and on and on. Nobody wants to be responsible for that. Now, the tech industry has ways of, kind of getting its message out there, communicating with the developers, announcing its products in ways that just don't have as much, maybe quite as much pizzazz, don't involve bringing people together from all over the world. It's, there is going to be less splash around it. There's going to be less of a, kind of a hubbub around it. But I think that's the reality that we're going to live in for the near term. You don't want to raise panic. You don't want to raise the alarm too far. But at the same time, nobody wants to be left holding the bag. If you bring together thousands of people for something in a short amount of time, and it ends up being a place where the virus spreads.
Right, yeah, not really worth the risk there. Ben, this might be a little bit obvious, or maybe it just seems obvious to me, but when I think about who might be able to withstand something like this a little easier, I think of the Facebooks and Googles of the world, basically companies that build all of their business not on hardware, not on that supply chain. Can you give us a sense of who might be best positioned to withstand this over the next couple weeks?
Absolutely. I think that, to me, there's probably three buckets of companies, and maybe others I haven't thought of, of companies that will probably do better and potentially do well. Companies that offer home communication, companies that offer home entertainment, and companies that offer home delivery, because the biggest change in consumer behavior or customer behavior that's going to happen with this virus is basically people staying home. And so if you think about home communication, what will people do more of if they're working from home? They're probably going to communicate more. That could benefit companies like Facebook, like Zoom, like Atlassian, etc., Google. If you think about home entertainment, it could well benefit Disney's new subscriber service, or Netflix, or Spotify, YouTube. If you think about home delivery, it will benefit companies like Domino's or Deliveroo, etc. So I think, to me, those are the buckets. To add an extra point on companies like Google and Facebook, they have been banned from China for quite some time, so they've also got less to lose if there are wobbles in the China market.
Ben, if you could expand just a little on those streaming services, that seems like a really obvious group of companies that might kind of benefit here in a way as people are spending more time at home. Do you have any sense of what they are doing to prepare? Do they need to do anything to prepare, or is it simply just keep the lights on?
If you think about what can they do more of, it would be potentially do more marketing. It would also be ensure their servers can cope with increased demand. They'd probably be the big two. They might roll out additional plans for whether it's awareness or services that were kind of borderline cases. But certainly, I'm sure there's a lot of people, customers, or potential customers out there who think, right, I've been on the fence about getting this new service. I'm going to be stuck at home for a long time. Maybe I'll invest there.
Tom, we were just talking to David Baker before you came on about how this is impacting the U.S. They've said it's just a matter of when, not a matter of if. Do you feel that Silicon Valley is prepared if this becomes a real widespread issue here in California? Yeah,
I think a lot of companies right now, and not just in Silicon Valley, but the tech sector more generally, which reaches all the way up into Seattle and further down south. Amazon today talked about how they're putting limits on non-essential travel, even in the U.S. for their employees. I think a lot of these companies have contingency plans in place where workers can do their jobs from home. You can program from home. You can contribute to to different projects from all over the world, and that's something that they already have been able to do. My colleague here talked about how conferencing. The technology is at the place now where companies like ours can get by in a case where a lot of people are working from home, and that's certainly the case for a lot of these companies in Silicon Valley. And it's also the services that come around it. Public transportation, schools. I just got a notice from my kid's school today about we're not telling anybody to stay home unless they're feeling unwell, but we're already making the plans for that.
Right. Well, this certainly won't be the last we're discussing coronavirus here. Ben Legg of Digital People International, and of course, Bloomberg Technology Global Executive Editor Tom Giles. Thank you both for joining us. Coming up, Digital Ad Vantage, how the president is differentiating himself from Democrats online. We look at how Facebook is shaping the election. That's next. And as we've mentioned, the S&P 500 tumbled 11% in the worst week since the 2008 financial crisis, wiping out almost $3 trillion in value from American equities. We'll stay on the markets throughout the hour. This is Bloomberg. A quick glance at the Facebook ad library shows that Donald Trump is spending big. He's not the top spender in that category, but he is dropping more dollars than all but Michael Bloomberg, the founder and majority holder of our parent company, to get his message across the social network. And a new analysis of that data by the nonprofit Tech for Campaigns shows another advantage the president has over his rivals: sheer volume. Between May of 2018 and January of this year, Trump ran 286,000 ads, nearly 25% more than the entire Democratic field combined. Now, to discuss all of this, we've got the co-founder of Tech for Campaigns, Jessica Alter, in Miami, and in Washington, professor of media and public affairs at George Washington University, Rebecca Tromble. Jessica, I'd love to start with you. You normally focus more on Democratic campaigns. You guys actually help some Democrats with their campaigns, but here you're focusing on a Republican, President Trump. What did you find in this research?
Yeah, I mean, our actual apparatus helps Democratic campaigns, but when we research, we want to research all campaigns and understand what's going on. And what we found in looking at the Facebook and Google ad archives is that Trump's digital operation is just much more sophisticated and much more integrated than any Democrat other than Michael Bloomberg, and his operation has really just ramped up in the last few months. So we found that, as you said, he's actually run 58,000 more variations of ads, which is sort of a proxy for how committed you are to A/B testing, message testing, and hence your sort of digital sophistication. And he is just steamrolling all Democrats other than Bloomberg on that.
Well, I was just going to ask, what is the real benefit of being able to test all of these different messages? I mean, I know how Facebook's targeted ad business works. You really can tailor a message to a specific group. Is it just that, or is there something else that's really an advantage here by having that volume of ads?
Yeah, it's not just about targeting. It's actually about learning and understanding what works and what doesn't, and being able to use that not only in your ads, but feed it into other parts of your campaign and operation, whether that's events or mail or TV or slogans or when you're door knocking. And that is actually one of the things that he benefits from. We actually looked at what candidates are asking for in their ads. Bernie and Pete are asking for money pretty much 60% of the time. Trump asks for money only about 25% of the time. The rest of the time, he's collecting information from voters on who they are and what they like, and he's using it to take the conversation off of Facebook, off of Google, and have a different kind of conversation where he knows a lot more about them. Maybe he'll ask for money later on, but he's really has a sophisticated voter data collection operation going on. And because his digital is more sophisticated, it makes his whole campaign better.
Rebecca, I want to bring you in here. I mean, it feels like as the incumbent, President Trump sort of gets to play on a different field than a lot of the Democrats when it comes to his digital campaign. How do you think the fact that he is now seeking re-election versus kind of competing with a bunch of others in a primary, how does that change the game for him?
Well, there are at least a couple of ways that this makes a difference when you compare his campaign to the Democrats. I mean, first of all, he's been building a digital campaign and relationships with the various platforms for digital advertising since 2015. So he simply has the long-term advantage of having learned how this space actually works. The Democratic challengers are also in the middle of a much bigger fight amongst themselves at the moment, right? A battle to try and figure out who's going to gain the actual resources. And so they have to really be focused on fundraising much more than the Trump campaign does. And that constitutes another major advantage for the Trump campaign.
You know, when I think about some of the ads that President Trump has ran, I can't help but remember that ad attacking Joe Biden a few months ago that some said was factually inaccurate. Do you feel that he's really pushing the envelope here in terms of what is allowed on these platforms? Is he doing that more than others, or is this just kind of the state of play for politics these days?
I think we're seeing that this is moving much more towards the normal, towards the state of play. But in many ways, the Trump campaign was first mover in this area. The Trump campaign has shown a willingness fairly early on to push boundaries, to break norms that were built over decades in traditional campaign practices on television and radio and so on. The digital space really is relatively new overall, even though, right, we've been talking about this since 2008, certainly. Still, candidates are figuring out what works in this space, and they've based their assumptions broadly on what they knew from decades past. But the Trump campaign, as early as 2015, showed its willingness to push these boundaries, to break norms. And so now we're starting to see other candidates follow suit, a real willingness to push these boundaries as well. But Trump has certainly been first actor in this area.
Yeah, Jessica, my colleague Josh Brustein wrote about some of this data yesterday, or actually this morning, I should say. And part of what came out was that, Mike Bloomberg and President Trump are both kind of advertising in a way that often you would see from a big company, not necessarily a politician. Can you talk us through a little bit about how those two in particular are tailoring their messages and how it might be different from other candidates?
Yeah, I think that, I don't think it's a coincidence that Bloomberg and Trump both come from the commercial world, and they're the two doing it differently. And Rebecca's right about the less pressure on Trump to fundraise than the Democratic candidates, but that's only part of the explanation. There is a problem in the Democratic Party with using digital for anything other than an ATM, and Trump and Bloomberg are sort of unencumbered by this is how we do it in politics viewpoint. And so they've actually taken on the way that the tactics used in the commercial world. So nothing Trump nor Bloomberg is doing are crazy or something that the commercial world isn't using. It's just that it's being skewed by most non-Trump, non-Bloomberg campaigns. And the other thing I would add is that there's nothing happening down ballot that is more sophisticated than the presidential campaigns typically. So 2020 is not just a presidential year. Of course, that is incredibly important, but on the line in 2020 is the Senate is redistricting, which state legislatures will decide. And we have to be able to ring the alarm bell and say, we got to change something if we want to win.
Okay, well, thank you. That was Jessica Alter of Tech for Campaigns and Rebecca Tromble of George Washington University. Thank you both for being here. Coming up, we stay on the markets as the S&P 500 fell for the 7th day, its longest slide since 2016. Dow Jones also in the red, while the NASDAQ indexes ended higher. This is Bloomberg. Let's take a look at some other tech headlines. Dell's latest profit forecast came up short. It's a sign that weaker corporate demand for personal computers will soon take its toll. Dell did project that disappointing server sales last quarter will rebound, but the company also announced plans for a $1 billion stock buyback. Federal Communications Commission wants to fine the country's 4 major phone companies $200 million for improperly disclosing customers' real-time location. T-Mobile would face the biggest fine of $91 million. The carriers, which also include AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint, can object to the proposed penalties. Location data makes it possible to identify the whereabouts of nearly any phone in the United States. Coming up, potential and peril. The viral glory that comes with advertising on TikTok also carries with it allegations of security risks. That is next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Kurt Wagner, in for Emily Chang in San Francisco. We have some breaking news for you regarding the coronavirus. The U.S. is telling its citizens to consider avoiding travel to Italy. Italy reported its first cases of the virus earlier this week. U.S. stocks have seen their worst week since the 2008 crisis as the spread of the coronavirus rattled global financial markets. Now, President Trump just spoke on the virus and the Fed involvement.
Well, I hope the Fed gets involved. I'm not a big fan of the Fed, you know that. I think they make a lot of mistakes. They've made a lot of mistakes. But I hope the Fed gets involved, and I hope they get involved soon. If you look at other countries, they're all stuffing the till. They're all going in there. They're putting in a lot of money. And our Fed sits there, doesn't do what they're supposed to be doing. But that's up to them. That's up to them. They're independent. But they've done this country a great disservice.
Now, despite the S&P and the Dow staying in the red, there is one sector showing a rebound: semiconductors. Look at some of the names that finished the day up. That's NVIDIA with a nearly 7% gain, joined by the likes of Micron, AMD, and more. Now, here to explain is our own Ian King, who covers the chip sector. Ian, what is happening here? Why are those stocks up today?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally what's going on is if you believe in, the way that technology normally works, then you're buying companies that are going to come back, where the fundamentals are the strongest. And if you believe in, the AI, if you believe in the growth of the cloud, if you believe in self-driving cars, then you think that chips are going to be the main beneficiaries of that, and they're a leading indicator. You would buy these guys 6, 8, or even longer months before you're expecting to see a return on that.
Ian, the semiconductor industry was on a bit of a tear up until the last week when the coronavirus obviously hit the markets. What was going well for that industry before all of this happened?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. The answer is, on a fundamental level, not a lot. They were dealing with inventory, they were dealing with some production issues in the case of Intel. So really there was nothing there in terms of the earnings that was driving those gains, even though 5 out of the top 10 performers on the S&P 500 last year were chip stocks, even though the index itself was up 60%. That's a Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. Again, it's back to that sense of, if you really believe in these kind of mega trends, if you believe that AI is going to take over computing and a lot of modern life, something has to power that, and that has to be semiconductors, first of all.
It still feels a little surprising to me. It seems like the semiconductor industry would be more vulnerable to all of this discussion we had been having at the beginning of the year around trade with China. Why do you think that it was able to kind of still grow despite all of that, contentious discussion?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a debate amongst investors and analysts, and clearly those who believe in the positive scenario have been winning, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, trade. China is the biggest market for the US semiconductor industry. Over a third of sales of chips actually happen in China, and an even larger percentage of chips go through China on their way to other places where they've become part of other devices. So yes, chip industry's got a huge amount to lose in trade, and yes, any disruption of the Chinese economy, of that consumption base of the largest market for PCs, the largest market for smartphones, is going to be really bad for chips. Even with all that in common knowledge, people have still been buying into the sector.
All right, that was Bloomberg's Ian King. Ian, thank you for joining us. I have some more breaking news now out of Washington. President Trump is nominating Republican Congressman John Ratcliffe to become the Director of National Intelligence. Now, Ratcliffe was Trump's pick to head the intelligence services back in August, but faced plenty of criticism over partisanship as well as his intelligence experience. Ratcliffe then withdrew his nomination, and Trump just announced his decision to try Ratcliffe again, and that was via Twitter. Now, changing directions when it comes to mobile advertising, the first names that come to mind tend to be Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, but the new kid on the block is coming on strong. That, of course, would be viral video app TikTok, which is claiming some pretty big numbers for its ad views. In one instance, it says a Chipotle promotion garnered nearly 4 billion views of a hashtag campaign. And this comes on an app that only has some 145 million downloads in the US. So here to help us break down these numbers is our very own Sarah Fryer. Sarah, you wrote about TikTok's ads business. What did you learn from talking with advertisers?
Well, there's really a sense of excitement whenever there's an app that is catching on with this coveted teen demographic. These are people who are just coming into their own in their spending. They're building their brand preferences that they may have for the rest of their lives. And so marketers want to reach them any way they can. And what's interesting about TikTok is we're seeing this huge first mover advantage that brands, including Chipotle, as you mentioned, are seeing multiple billions of views on their hashtag campaigns, which any CMO is very excited about. But there's some concern there, because when I asked TikTok what counts as a view, they would not publicly define it.
Yeah, well, you actually may have gotten to my next question, which was, if I'm going to get 4 billion views views on a campaign, why are there not more advertisers flocking to this company right now?
Well, it's really complicated because while TikTok is the shiny new object in advertising, they don't necessarily have all the targeting options that you can get on Facebook and YouTube, the other platforms you mentioned. What you have on TikTok is a promise of a large audience, but you're not necessarily going to get granular about what people are interested in, what their purchase history is, more detailed demographic information, and it'll take TikTok time to build that up. That said, they are owned by a Chinese company, and there is a lot of national security concern around TikTok gathering data on its young US users.
Yeah, can you give us a sense? I mean, what makes Facebook advertising, Instagram advertising so fantastic is that they have this wealth of information about people. TikTok doesn't have that yet. You mentioned some of the concerns around China. What kind of do they have from a targeting standpoint right now?
You can find somebody based on their age range, maybe their geography, but really what advertisers are getting is these metrics for engagement, that their hashtag was viewed X number of times by X number of people. And you're not really getting a lot of that more granular return on investment information. One thing I will say as well is it's kind of complicated to do ads for TikTok. It's not just about, slapping on the same ad that you would put elsewhere. They are this very specific kind of content. It tends to have to be funny. You have to use famous TikTok creators to help create buzz around the brand. So it really is a lot of involved investment. Chipotle told me that they cater to the Hype House, which is a house full of kids creating TikTok videos, all of them with millions of followers.
And getting free burritos.
Getting free burritos.
Along the way. You mentioned in your story that they're looking to push towards some kind of ad tech platform where an advertiser wouldn't have to deal with a salesperson. They could just go online and do this themselves. What is that all about?
So that's in testing right now, but eventually it could be a self-service platform for any advertiser to go on and buy ads that they want. Now, we've seen that happen before with Snapchat and with Instagram. When they move to this self-service platform, ad prices drop. It gets a little bit more formulaic, all about reaching the right kind of people. In order to reach the right kind of people, you have to have the right kind of data. And so we'll see if TikTok's able to make that happen.
So this is one of those apps that is getting a ton of traction. It's all over the radar of Facebook executives. You know that, and I know that. How worried do you think Facebook and Instagram should be that TikTok has got this kind of momentum right now?
Well, we have a quote recently from Sheryl Sandberg saying that she is, in fact, very worried about TikTok, and I can read it for you here. She says, "They're huge, they're growing really quickly, they've gotten to bigger numbers faster than we ever did. Of course we worry about it, and we have to be worried about all the innovation." Facebook, historically a very paranoid company about any up-and-coming properties.
Yeah, typically they like to either buy or copy. In this case, it seems pretty unlikely that they're going to be able to buy something like TikTok. Do you think it's realistic to assume that means they're going to move in the copy direction?
Absolutely. They're going to try many different ways through IGTV, through some of their other creative video properties like Stories, to try to capture that excitement around TikTok.
All right, TikTok from Facebook will probably be coming soon. That was Bloomberg's Sarah Frier. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. Coming up, a coffee mug that never gets cold, a security camera that scares away criminals. We'll hear from the designer of these products and more. This is Bloomberg. Founded in 2007, Ammunition is a product design studio responsible for creating iconic products such as Beats by Dre, Square, Lyft, and Polaroid. Here to tell us about the design process and how the retail experience can be improved with better product design is Ammunition founder and partner Robert Bruner. Bruner previously designed products for Apple, Adobe, and more. He's the latest guest on our Retail Transformed series. Robert, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Walk me through, we were just talking about this. I want to know, when you are designing something, how much are you saying, I need to give people what they're asking for, versus, the now famous, I need to give people what they don't yet know they want?
It's actually a combination of both, right? Especially when you're doing something new, you're introducing new ways of doing things, new functionality, new technology. But I believe it needs to be in a familiar format that people understand, right? If you reinvent something to be entirely new, you're probably not going to get the acceptance that you want. So you sort of start with a basis of what people know and draw them into what it's doing that's new and beneficial in their lives.
Could you give us an example of something you've worked on that kind of threads that needle a little bit?
Yeah, the June oven was a great example because it uses an enormous amount of technology. It recognizes your food, it weighs it, it measures temperature, it follows a script in helping you cook. But ultimately, it has to look and behave like an oven, right? And when we started, we said this could be anything, but it needs to be an oven, just a damn good one, right? And so that, if it was something that was a spherical ball floating on a magnetic cushion on your counter, people probably wouldn't have tried.
Wouldn't even know to put their food in.
Yeah, exactly.
When you think about design, and when I think about design, this whole idea of real simplicity, right, is certainly appreciated. I'm wondering, as a non-designer, how much of that is a trend, is something that is hot now? How much of that is just built into the way that things should be designed?
For me, it's built in. It's always been that way. Right? Simple is timeless. Simple is beautiful. Simple is the way things should be. Now, what's challenging today is things are very complex. So the art and process of making it simple is very challenging, and it takes a lot to do that. And we spend an enormous amount of time figuring out how to make complex technology very simple and understandable and easy, because otherwise, again, it won't be successful.
Yeah, you mentioned the oven. You have a coffee mug, a thermos as well. What's a product out there that you haven't worked on? What's a product that's in need of a redesign right now?
Oh, man. I would say, there's a lot of things that I see them constantly, and I have 6 kids, right? So I've gone through a lot, and constantly in children's products, there's just an enormous amount of bad design and non-functional design and waste, right? I really think that it's about time to start putting as much attention on products for children and their parents as we do putting on phones and watches and so forth. It's just a category that's not given enough attention.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the products that I buy, sometimes the packaging is just gorgeous, right? I mean, you would know coming from Apple, right? That feeling of opening the box. At the same time, there are times I buy things and I'm like, there is so much material here that I'm throwing away. It seems wasteful. How much does the idea of the environment of the product that you're actually using for packaging, how much does that come into play with you?
All across the board, especially in packaging, right? We're constantly looking at how to reduce material in packaging, but just in general in all the product development, we've reached a tipping point where in the past it was a good thing to do if you can, right? And because usually there was a cost associated with making something sustainable, so companies kind of felt it was optional. Today they don't have any choice. Consumers demand it, which is great news, because we no longer have the arguments about whether to spend the time and money to make it sustainable. It's just something you have to do to be competitive.
Yeah, it's absolutely expected. Robert Bruner, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for being here. We have to jump to a little bit of breaking news here, but thank you for joining us. More breaking news. There is now a second case of the coronavirus in California. That's according to the Washington Post. The origin of this new case is unknown at the moment, but the Post says the person is a 65-year-old from Santa Clara County. Now, still ahead, a continued look at how tech companies are weathering the coronavirus storm. Our conversation with Elevation Partners co-founder Roger McNamee next. This is Bloomberg. Apple CEO Tim Cook suggested the iPhone maker wouldn't make any quick moves out of China in light of interruptions due to the coronavirus. In an interview with Fox Business, Cook also called the situation a, quote, temporary condition. Apple's China-focused supply chain is facing 2 major tests, first from a trade war between the U.S. and China, and more recently from manufacturing outages spurred by the spread of the virus. Now, earlier this week, Emily Chang spoke with Robert McNamee, co-founder of Elevation Partners, about the impact of the coronavirus on Apple's supply chain.
To be clear, I am a long-term holder. That is just my investment style. And what I see at Apple is a company that's positioned radically better than most tech companies across a wide range of potential outcomes. Clearly, if coronavirus is a catastrophic issue for the economy as a whole, if it's a catastrophic issue for basically the market, then Apple as a stock is going to be a bad place to be. If you take the sort of middle of the road position, which I take, which is that coronavirus will be bad and that people will recover from it, adjust, and move forward, then I think Apple is really well positioned. It has a particularly attractive set of products today, and it has a business that it's built around privacy at a moment in time when that issue is really becoming front of mind for more people. So I think the opportunity for iPhones to take share away from Android has literally never been better. And I'm quite hopeful that coronavirus will be something that the world can contain without too much damage and that the stock will rebound quickly. We'll have to see.
Now, when it comes to China, there's obviously the supply chain issues, but also the demand issues. I'm curious how you see the impact to the Chinese tech scene, which of course has been rising leading into this.
Yeah, I mean, Emily, the really huge difference between today and the last time we had a pandemic is how much more important China is, not just to the world supply chain, but also to its demand. And I mean, I want to say it's risen by more than 10 points in terms of global output. And as a consequence, for Apple in particular, demand in China is a huge deal. Now, in a world where people are not allowed to go out much, where they have to stay in, smartphones are going to take on a greater role, so it's possible that, relatively speaking, Apple could be a beneficiary on the demand side. But if people aren't allowed to go out at all, if they're not allowed to shop at all, that's obviously going to be a problem for everyone's demand, and Apple will suffer in that particular instance. But as I look at China, what I note is that they went into coronavirus with a strategy of using surveillance to drive behavior in directions that the government liked. And there is a tremendous article in the current issue of The Atlantic by Professor Zeynep Tufekci, who is at University of North Carolina, which she observes that it is entirely possible that the massive surveillance and behavioral manipulation that takes place in China blinded the government to the initial news about coronavirus, that essentially two things were going on. First is all of that data gave them a false sense of security that they knew what was going on. And secondly, all of the people who were in a position to know about coronavirus were afraid in a world where everything they're doing is being tracked to share bad news. And the result of this was that weeks were lost and coronavirus got off to a start that past epidemics did not have. And if that hypothesis is correct, that's a real condemnation of what Google and Facebook are doing, because they're essentially trying to replicate China's information technology strategy, their behavioral manipulation strategy outside of China.
Meantime, in another reminder of how globally connected we all are, in the U.S. political election, you've got U.S. intelligence telling Senator Bernie Sanders that the Russians have been interfering in his campaign. Vice President Joe Biden saying that they're attacking him on Facebook. You, of course, wrote the book on this. How vulnerable are we now in 2020 of Russian interference in the U.S. election, despite all the warnings and what happened before?
So the good news, Emily, is there have been warnings. People have been trying to raise the alarm since 2016. The bad news is that Facebook, Google, and Twitter have not made the changes that would be required to protect elections from disinformation and from interference. And the actual infrastructure for voting is every bit as vulnerable as it was in 2016. Now, I'm not in a position to be able to evaluate the intelligence about what the Russians may or may not be doing, either around the Trump campaign or around the Sanders campaign. What I would observe, though, is that the amount of disinformation being created actively by the Trump campaign and by networks that are essentially supporters of the Sanders campaign is so great this cycle that it's not clear that the Russians are necessary as an agent to mess this thing up. And to me, that's what's really troubling, is that we're in this environment where it's very hard for any voter to know what they can believe, because if they are on Google, on Facebook, or on Twitter, the amount of nonsense is so great that it's just incredibly difficult to get at the facts.
You've got the Justice Department in the United States and the FTC pursuing antitrust investigations against Facebook, Google, big tech in general. How much teeth do you think those investigations have now that we're some months into this? And how much could it hurt, or will it hurt, these companies?
Well, I think it's going to take a long time for antitrust to play out, but I really tip my hat both to the FTC and the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, because in contrast to their counterparts during the Obama and Bush administrations, the Trump teams have really focused on this as an issue, and as a result, I'm very pleased with the progress they're making. But antitrust, as you know, it often takes a decade, and so we should not be expecting any kind of immediate response, which is why stocks have not shown any concern about it at all, because it's not a near-end thing. I think from a regulatory perspective, Emily, the greater threat is going to come in Europe.
That was Roger McNamee, author of Zucked and the co-founder of Elevation Partners. And as we end this hour, let's take a look at where the U.S. stocks ended the day. The S&P 500 plunged 11% in the 5 days, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average careened to the lowest since June. Now that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Don't forget, Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out @Technology. Be sure to follow our global breaking news network @QuickTake on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.